Welcome to the latest in the series of LRB podcasts about British and American poetry, drawing on the rich archive of essays and reviews and memoirs of poets that have appeared over the years in the London Review of Books. The subject of our podcast today is the American poet Sylvia Plath. My name is Seamus Perry. I teach English literature at the University of Oxford, and I'm talking, as usual, with Mark Ford, poet, critic and Professor of English at University College London. But also, unusually, I'm pleased to say, we are joined by Joanna Biggs, who is an editor at the Review and, most pertinently, the author of a long and absorbing piece about Plath that appeared in the paper in the last number for 2018. And we're going to consider some examples of Plath's poetry chronologically as she moved from America to England and had a second career, as it were, as a poet here. That's the way we've run most of our podcasts in this series, that is to say, biographically. But for Plath, Mark, would you say the biographical approach has its weaknesses as well as its strengths?
Yes. Part of the difficulty of discussing Plath is that feelings run very, very high, and from the time that Ariel came out in 1965, there was extreme reactions to it, and on the one hand, people tend to or often read the poetry as somehow symptomatic of the problems that eventually drove Plath to take her own life in 1963 when she was 30. And while one can't screen out the facts about Plath's life, it can distract one from the extraordinary innovations which she develops in her poetry and makes one lose track of the poetic narrative, the way that she develops from this rather formal and controlled poet who's experimenting with different kinds of 1950s, rather kind of, in some ways, rather controlled and dry poems that connect with the ideals of the new criticism, which were prominent in that era, to a poet who got infamously labelled confessional. It's not a very useful term, I don't think, because the poems aren't confessions. One can't read them as autobiography, but there are autobiographical details encoded in them. For instance, the reference to the 7 years marriage in Daddy is the most famous example. It's clearly a reference to her own 7 years with Ted Hughes, and one can't exclude that from one's understanding or reading of the poem. So I think the reader, and we'll probably be exploring that in this hour, is in a rather problematic position when reading Plath poems. To what extent you are treating them as words on the page and construing them as you might construe a Tennyson poem, and to what extent you are connecting them with not only the biographical details that you know, but Plath's own mythologizing of her life and the events in it and her relationship with Hughes and with her father. So that the kind of mythical strand is one which shades into the biographical strand in a way which is confusing, but also extremely kind of innovative and fertile and exciting in different ways.
Yes, in her extraordinary piece in the London Review of Books about writing or not writing the life of Sylvia Plath, Jacqueline Rose says how biography loves Sylvia Plath. That's her phrase. So mindful that we mustn't love biography too much, but nor must we forget it. Let's start by thinking about her early years as she developed into the person who wrote those early kind of more formal poems that you just referred to, Mark. We'll have a look at a couple of those in a moment. Jo, can you tell us something about her background, her upbringing, her first years, what saw her through to that place at Smith College?
Yeah, so she was born on the 27th of October, 1932. The 27th of October was everyone remembers their birthday, but for Plath it was a thing. We have a poem for her birthday. We have lots of things written on her birthday in a particular way. And she grew up she was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and that area, again, the way it connects to the universities, her desire to study at goes on to get the scholarship at Smith and then goes to study at Cambridge. Her mother taught at the university. There's a kind of academic and a real valuing of all those academic qualities, really ambitious to do well and very self-punishing, I think, on not keeping up the exact sort of trajectory she thinks she should have kept up at points. And also the landscape of that area. I was thinking as well of the beaches. Norsec Beach comes up in Daddy. There's this whole, goes back to Boston when she's grown up. She keeps coming back to Smith. All of that's really important to her. Her father dies when she's 8. And her mother famously reported that she said, "Well, I'll never talk to God again." And she was sort of a febrile, sort of very self-critical sort of teenager, wanting everything, wanting sex, wanting men, wanting, when she, in her teenage years, she's just hungry for experience and hungry to write really good poems, live well and do it in good sentences. That's what she says in her journal. So that's the sort of person we're dealing with.
I think the New England aspect of it is one that is really interesting, and that especially the traditions of New England introspection, which sort of date back to the Transcendentalists and Emerson and Thoreau, and the extent to which the Puritan tradition, in which still I think can be seen as kind of having some effect on the ways in which Plath considers interiority, meant this rigorous self-examination was somehow, that was the way to God. She said she wouldn't speak to God. But for all the 19th century transcendentalists and New England divines, that kind of self-examination was a kind of crucial notion of the development of selfhood, ideally a selfhood that becomes religious and goes to heaven. Not the case with Plath. But I think it's worth connecting her to that particular link with New England. And of course, a link which was predominantly male, that the women in that tradition were figured as witches quite often. And in terms of the biographical aspect, there is a kind of strand which has figures the extent to which Plath's work can be read as a kind of curse, or is somehow an enchant, or as a curse or a bewitchment, as somehow connecting to that particular strand of American history.
Yes, and the New England philosophers like Emerson, as you say, constantly return to this idea that the nature you perceive depends upon the eye with which you perceive nature. So it's not a pure subjectivism, but there is a real nature out there too. But at the same time, the kinds of things that you perceive are always going to be mediated or somehow screened or filtered through the lens of your own selfhood. And that, in a way, could be the motto of lots and lots of Plath poems.
I think that's the template of the Plath poem, a kind of landscape that then gets filled with subjective elements that presented in a kind of extreme or expressionist form. And again, you're kind of blending her own selfhood with what she's observing.
I think that's a helpful way to think about the confessional aspect too, or the thing that we're sort of a bit mistrustful of when these kind of moments in my life appear. What happens to them? What does she do to them? How do they become poetic? How do they become mythic? That's the thing that, well, when I was reading the poems, I'd find, a vase of cornflowers and poppies, and they would appear in a poem, but it doesn't help. Sometimes it's more of a mystery.
But the fact that you connect them is interesting, because that sort of is linking with the Rose diagnosis of our biographical kind of obsession or hunger with kind of details of Plath's life. And it is unlike the case of, I think, almost any other poet, except perhaps T.S. Eliot. There's a similar kind of appetite for finding out about the Eliot-Vivian relationship as there is that of the Hughes-Plath relationship. And it magnetises us for various ways, or readers, and has done for kind of decades now. And maybe there's nothing more you can say about them. Then that's the way it is.
I think one of you is keener to use biography than the other. Anyway, with that, we shall proceed. So here we are. We've got this extraordinarily high-achieving young woman, full of ambition, the kind of personality who, as Jo says in her piece, had to be good at everything. And one of the things that she sets out to be good at is to be a poet as Mark was saying in his earlier remarks, very much in the school of 1950s formal poetry, formalist-minded poetry. Could you say something a little bit about that academic culture, Mark, and then maybe give us an example of the sorts of poem that she was writing?
Yes, American poetry in the 50s was very much dominated by the ideals of what were called the New Critics, Cleance Brooks, Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, and poetry had moved into the universities as well. I think that's the kind of crucial point to make, that rather than being wild bohemians, most of the poets were working as teachers of poetry, and even the wild ones like Lowell and Berryman, who behaved appallingly when they did get these university jobs, were kind of, were kept on however badly they behaved because they were kind of stars and it was good for the faculty. So Plath grew up at Smith, which was a very high-achieving college, and was a high achiever, although she also had problems while she was there, including her suicide attempt, her first one. But she started out writing these rather formal poems, which nod very often to W.H. Auden in particular. One I wanted to look at was a little kind of rondo. It's called Bluebeard. And I've never met anyone who's sort of mentioned it, or I've never come across it in any criticism. But reading through the Juvenilia, this seemed to me a poem that captures some of the later Plath's ability to combine myth with repetition in a kind of hypnotic, rather haunting way. I'll just read it since people are unlikely to be familiar with this little poem. Bluebeard. I am sending back the key that let me into Bluebeard's study. Because he would make love to me, I am sending back the key. In his eyes' darkroom, I can see my X-rayed heart, dissected body. I am sending back the key that let me into Bluebeard's study.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Series 1 of Modernish Poets. To listen to the full series and to all our other close reading series, sign up at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link below.